And I think a lot of the challenges, of course, are quite different from connecting a battery or for connecting generation, of course. You're going to have challenges that are going to crop up because large demand, yeah, sure, there are large demand connections now, but going down this route of having large demand connections without any generation attached to it is quite different.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Roadnight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Welcome to another one of Roadnight Taylor's podcasts. I'm Pete Aston and I'm joined today by Catherine Cleary.
Hi, Pete.
And Carl Murchie.
Hi, Pete.
So today we are going to be giving a bit of an introduction, bit of a flavour on the subject of hydrogen. Not particularly on the chemistry of it, but more about how it connects into the grid and what that looks like. Yeah, it's just a bit of an awareness exercise for listeners out there to get some idea as to where things are going in the GB with hydrogen. So, Kyle, can you just give us a little bit of an introduction to start with in terms of how hydrogen is being proposed to be used, at least in GB, and some of the sort of knock-on implications as to grid connections and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So hydrogen, the intention is to create hydrogen. So there's multiple different methods of creation of hydrogen, and then utilise that for various different sectors within GB. So it's not just a specific sector, single sector focus. It's looking at using hydrogen effectively in replacement for natural gas or potentially to kind of decarbonise other industries. So probably the best place to start is that there are kind of 6 industrial clusters, as it's been known. The term cluster sequencing is quite commonly used by government, and those 6 clusters are all at different stages of development. So you tend to find they're near ports, near kind of large industrial areas where there's already kind of pipelines in place, the sort of infrastructure that would both be able to transport, potentially store, and utilise hydrogen for that in the first instance, and then to be maybe transported out and used elsewhere in other markets. The government has a hydrogen strategy, and just in December 2023, they came out with a hydrogen roadmap, and this is to indicate where they think hydrogen is going to go in the future, how it kind of collocates and matches in with these clusters, and likes of carbon capture and storage for kind of large industrial users of kind of natural gas at this moment in time, and how the funding structure will look as well over particularly up to 2030, and then maybe the kind of 2030 to 2040 sort of timescales.
So there is a government subsidy structure effectively to try and incentivise the development of hydrogen electrolysis.
There is, but at the moment that's all structured around kind of from now to up to 2030. So the expectation is that if you're going into the subsidy rounds now, you'll be getting subsidies for connection before 2030.
So how do these subsidy rounds work then?
Yeah, so they're known as HARs, so Hydrogen Allocation Rounds. So that's going to be another acronym for everybody to get used to. HAR 1 has, been and gone. It's completed, and late last year, those that were successful and have negotiated contracts have completed those contracts, and those projects are likely to come online in 2025, so pretty soon.
Sorry, just to jump in on that. Was that specific types of hydrogen production? Because there's various colours of hydrogen production.
Yes.
that I'm aware of. Was that just one type of hydrogen production, or was that open to
blue and
to everything?
Yeah, so the projects were varied in terms of they were all scored on various different criteria. So if you were going to be going down the route of non-green hydrogen, for example, then you wouldn't obviously have scored as highly in certain areas of the scoring mechanism. But it wasn't just about production. So some of the projects were also looking at a kind of full life cycle process. So maybe creating hydrogen at a testbed scale, so 20 to 40 megawatt sort of size, and then using that hydrogen within a generator. Others were then looking at maybe storing it. Some were looking at co-locating hydrogen electrolyzers with wind. So it wasn't specific that you had to be an electrolyzer, for example, but most of the projects, without knowing the detail of all of them, most of them have gone down the electrolyzer route to some description.
And you showed me a table of all the schemes. Was it like 15, 20 schemes or something? And they each had a capacity associated with them.
Yes.
I can't remember what you said, whether that was electrical capacity or hydrogen sort of energy capacity, as it were.
Yes, so I'm pretty sure all the figures that are quoted in the hydrogen roadmap are all hydrogen gas capacity in megawatts. So it's not about the electrical capacity used, because of course you might not be creating it through electrolysis. It could be coming from some other hydrogen creation source. So therefore those figures are all based on hydrogen energy, hydrogen power level, which is quite important, because if you were then thinking about what does that mean for an electrical connection, if you are going for an electrolyser, then you need to think about, well, what do you actually need from the electrical system to then give you that amount of megawatt of output from an electrolyser.
So just coming back to these allocation rounds, so if you're successful in one of those hydrogen allocation rounds, I assume that means you have to be connected by a certain type, producing hydrogen by a certain point in time. So it's quite sort of prescriptive.
Yeah, absolutely. So the hydrogen allocation rounds that are known, that are kind of mapped out in the production roadmap, are HAR1, HAR2, HAR3 and HAR4. So as I said, HAR1, already the contracts are in place. HAR2, really topical, because the expression of interest closed, I think, today. And then from that, if you've submitted an expression of interest, you will then be allowed to effectively put in an application. And that application is due in springtime. So during that phase, you've got to fill in an application form. And
so, sorry, this is an application form for
HAR2
government
round, yeah. So it goes into deadlines.
Not a grid application.
Sorry. Yes. So that would be your application for funding support. Yep. Importantly, you don't have to have a grid application at that particular point in time, but the aim of HAR2 is to be live into kind of 2028 sort of timescale. So if you don't have a grid connection yet, then 2028 is a bit on the ambitious side. But importantly, even going out to HAR4, which won't be starting until kind of 2026, 2027 time, then they're still expecting that those projects will be online ideally by 2030 or into the early 2030s. Potentially there's maybe a little bit of scope to change that there.
And those are pretty ambitious timeframes from a grid connection perspective. So if people are looking at hydrogen electrolyzers, and they're starting that process now, actually, in a lot of places, they will be hard pressed to get grid offers with connection dates this side of 2030.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the challenges, of course, are quite different from connecting a battery or for connecting generation, of course. You're going to have challenges that are going to crop up because large demand, yeah, sure, there are large demand connections now, but going down this route of having large demand connections without any generation attached to it is quite different, as we've also all discussed quite a lot internally.
Do you think it's an oversight from the government to not include grid connection viability in their HAR scoring exercise?
So they do have a section on electrical supply. So there's a feedstock section and an electrical supply section, all within one area of kind of deliverability. So it's kind of 40% of the application process. So they do ask some quite specific questions on what stage your grid application's at. Are you modifying something? But yes, there's obviously an expectation that process is relatively straightforward, and that having a grid offer now would almost automatically guarantee that you can effectively get connected in the next few years.
And I suppose there might be, coming back to the kind of grid strategy side of this, there might be quite a few applicants who are looking at going into future HAR rounds who are thinking, well, I've got an existing generation connection, I just want to modify that to add, electrolysis sort of effectively behind the meter or something. So there could, whereas there might be other parties who are looking at creating larger standalone electrolysis sites, and they'll be facing quite different grid challenges in terms of timeframe, kind of regulatory issues around how we treat sort of final demand. Hydrogen electrolysis, I think we're probably all fairly clear now, is going to be treated as final electricity demand from a kind of network perspective.
It's also worth saying, is it, Carl, because I know you confirmed this for me yesterday, you don't have to be going through a HAR round to connect a hydrogen electrolysis scheme.
No,
you could go it alone without any subsidies at all.
Yeah, and importantly, I suppose the focus has been on kind of HAR 1 to 4 because they are defined in a little bit more detail of what the timescales will be. But in the delivery roadmap, it does indicate a kind of HAR 5 to HAR 7. So the expectation is that the funding will continue to be, continue to support developers as time moves on. But of course, that will be in line with how the technology develops and the challenges that come out in the market as well. But yeah, if you're a developer looking at a transmission scale connection and you don't have any access now, and you're therefore looking at definitely into the 2030s, then yes, you may have to progress the projects now more at risk, knowing that there may be future support, but not at this time.
You mentioned about clusters earlier. So obviously clusters are going to have a big impact on like the grid side of things, because if, there are lots of schemes clustering in certain locations, it's going to put impact on grid, so it's not necessarily going to be sort of spread uniform across the country. Perhaps like we've seen with, generation has been a bit more spread out all the way across the country. So what are the clusters to start with? And then Catherine's going to say something.
Well, I was going to say, this clustering impact is really important because it potentially exacerbates some of the issues that we've been seeing in terms of considering especially very large-scale new electrolysis plants seeking connections at transmission level. Part of that's because if you're a 500 megawatt, 800 megawatt, 1 gigawatt scheme and you want to, add that much final demand onto the network, there are some, it's probably worth the saying without going to the detail, there are some quite strict kind of design considerations about how we design the network to be secure enough to supply demand, which means that you start needing kind of resilience, redundancies, firm connections. That might mean that you start needing multiple bays at a substation to facilitate projects. Once you've got lots of projects all focusing on hydrogen in a particular area, you're suddenly starting to need brand new substations. Because you've got lots of bays required, you're starting to kind of trigger much more strategic network reinforcement potentially. And all of that really raises a lot of still open questions about how do we design the network, the transmission network in particular, to facilitate hydrogen connections? Because perhaps treating them like a data center or something isn't the right answer. Maybe, some of these proposals are likely to be quite flexible in terms of how they operate that hydrogen electrolyzer potentially, maybe wanting to run it at times a very low system pricing, it becomes more like a flexibly dispatched storage asset. Some of them might want to run that hydrogen electrolyzer kind of continuously for other economic reasons of the electrolyzer cost. So how electrolyzers are going to be used is sort of something that none of us really know at the moment. And it's obviously really key for the TOs, people like National Grid and the ESO to consider that because it helps them inform their assumptions.
I guess there's the potential for the transmission companies to use hydrogen to help relieve constraints on the system caused by generation.
I absolutely think that's something that we will see coming forwards, essentially, potentially a new revenue stream for hydrogen, or a new kind of location signal to effectively try and encourage the location of hydrogen in places where we've got perhaps very large volumes of offshore wind connected, to help reduce long distance transmission reinforcement.
Yeah, with constraint costs across the Scotland-England boundary are huge, aren't they? So, could some of that money go to supporting a service for reducing those constraints from hydrogen schemes?
Yeah, and I think all of that's really important. It seems quite far off in terms of system operation. 2030, we're sort of 6 years away. But I think in terms of the way that we frame the connections process, the sort of things like construction planning assumptions that we use, kind of firm, non-firm assumptions, and how we treat those hydrogen applications, that's all stuff that needs to be bottomed out now because people are applying for these big schemes now.
Yeah. Carl's furiously typing away on his computer. I don't know whether he's ordering something from Amazon or, just making some notes as we go along. So, yeah, so I asked about the clusters earlier.
Yes, and that's exactly what I was trying to make sure that I had the kind of right terms. Because the one thing I would say about the clusters, I mentioned 6 earlier, they do vary slightly and they do kind of come and go because the cluster is effectively an amalgamation of multiple projects, a kind of collaboration activity. There are 3 clusters that have really gone forward to either kind of track 1 or reserve track status. So track 1 would include HyNet and East Coast cluster, and track 2 would be the Acorn cluster. So in terms of location, the HyNet cluster is on the west coast of GB and it's on the west coast of Northern England, whereas the East Coast cluster is in the Humber, and then Acorn cluster is up at Peterhead in Scotland. So those are the 3 that under hydrogen are kind of seen as the main hydrogen clusters at this moment in time. But as I said, there are others. There's one down in kind of Southampton that's moving forward as well, and a number of others developing across the UK. So that could change quite quickly.
Are these all inevitably built around where there are ports for transport, or is that not such a thing, do you think?
So ports for transport, yes, potentially, but also quite importantly, a lot of this is driven by not just the hydrogen aspect, but also the carbon capture. So in some clusters, carbon capture is actually the leading aspect, and hydrogen is then more secondary. But therefore, if you're looking at carbon capture, you need to have a location where you can actually put the carbon. So in those circumstances, it would be where there are maybe natural gas caverns that have capacity for that carbon dioxide. And therefore, if that is an eligible location, then it makes sense to also include hydrogen as well, because you'd be laying pipelines side by side, and a lot of the industry could convert over to hydrogen as well. So it's not a straightforward reasoning why those particular parties would be based.
And just mentioning some of those clusters, immediately to my mind's going, those places are places where generation issues are difficult.
I was going to say,
Bays might have already been allocated.
It's the easiest place to connect, right? Yeah, yes. And I guess, similarly, Humber, there's a huge correlation there between offshore wind and potential hydrogen connections. And I suppose there is a really key strategic grid point, which we probably all need to be thinking about in terms of whether these schemes at the moment are sort of fighting over some of the physical capacity restrictions, when in reality, from a holistic system perspective, they actually help facilitate each other. That generation and that demand being co-located does help us kind of reduce transmission constraints overall. But there does need to be some thought and perhaps a shift from some of the business as usual approach towards demand connection, from an ESO perspective, transmission in particular, to try and help overcome some of those barriers.
There's issues with just bay allocation, isn't there? If you run out of 400 kV or 275 kV bays,
you've triggered a new substation.
Yeah.
And you're 8-10 years away from connecting, so you really struggle to meet any of those sort of those HAR round dates.
I think just quite important, although we've mentioned about the clusters, and that's probably where we're going to see some of the larger scale kind of developments, or certainly the larger scale developments moving forward in the shorter term. There will be, there's another drive for hydrogen electrolyzers for other industries. So it could be in kind of more local decarbonisation of industry, particularly the smaller projects going through the initial HAR rounds. A lot of developers might be looking to co-locate with wind just to test out the technology and understand whether that could be used to create something during a time of constraint. So particularly those that are constrained are looking at, well, could we put a hydrogen electrolyser in there and potentially use that hydrogen more locally?
We said this was going to be a short intro. It's slowly expanding into less of a short intro. But I think it would be good to sort of finish with just thinking a bit more specifically about some of the grid issues. So pick up on some of the sort of specifics as to what it looks like and what are the impacts on the grid of connecting hydrogen. I guess we're mostly talking about hydrogen electrolysis here, aren't we? But, do we get the electrolysis combining with generation as well at these same sites?
Yeah, I think the danger is, on the face of it, you think, well, putting a large demand in an area where there's a lot of generation makes fantastic sense and is actually a massive benefit to the GB system. But as soon as you get into the detail, you realise that quite quickly that's not really the full picture. So we've just mentioned bay allocation, and actually just getting access, the kind of physical access is going to be a challenge. But then there's also quite a few contractual and kind of market aspects that will also be a bit of a barrier in terms of kind of current rules around kind of planning methodologies and the work that system planning teams would do to try and understand what impact you're going to have on the network, whether you're classed as, well, exactly where you're classed on the network and where the network ends effectively from the TO's aspect. So I know we've discussed quite a lot of that internally.
So I think in a nutshell, a lot of these things are not cut and dried yet. There is not a clear policy as to how all hydrogen demand connections will be treated at transmission. So it's probably worth thinking that actually things like those sort of pre-application strategic discussions with the TOs needs to take place before applications go in. I think, we absolutely wouldn't advise just sort of wanging in an application for a gigawatt of hydrogen. Thinking about how that site's going to be used commercially, probably to be able to provide the best possible data to try and kind of underpin decent construction planning assumptions is also probably kind of a good and important step in the right direction.
I think
there's a lot to still
be really quite key as well, because unless you know exactly where your location's going to be, which I think with a lot of the initial hydrogen developments, thinking about where clusters are going to be, thinking about where the industry is going to be, if you're looking to move forward a project now, then actually knowing geographically where is probably quite challenging, maybe compared to other technologies, like traditional generation technologies.
And it's interesting, just on a different subject, what the DNOs and the ENA have done recently with battery demand is they've implemented various tactical solutions that we did a podcast on a few weeks back. Is that going to be required for hydrogen? Because, like Catherine said, hydrogen is extremely flexible. Does it need rules around, giving non-firm connections to hydrogen schemes, like have been to battery schemes? So the DNOs are probably going to have to start thinking about this as some of the smaller electrolysis schemes come along.
And it's going to need to be a conversation, isn't it? Because I think whereas batteries, we now have, 5 years of decent experience of people actually energizing batteries, beginning to see the commercial use cases and some really kind of, now kind of quite sort of mature operators in that market. We don't have that operational experience as a nation with hydrogen electrolysis. So actually, I think there's still a lot to be considered about. Is it economic to just run a massive hydrogen electrolyzer when it's windy, or have you put so much capital investment in it that really you need to be running it to extract hydrogen, 24/7?
I think particularly if it becomes kind of cross-vector, this is where we're going really. If you've got hydrogen that will connect into pipelines, if that's the kind of longer-term route, then you're now going to potentially have conflicts between two markets that ultimately they all fit in within the GB energy system, but how do you manage that? And what does that market impact look like on the network itself?
Last thing I've got on my list before we probably should wrap up was just specifically for transmission connections around securities and cancellation charges for demand schemes, which are obviously different now from generation schemes.
Yes. So if at the moment, if you put in an application for a demand-only scheme like a hydrogen electrolyzer with no generation behind it at all, you will come under what's known as the final sums methodology for securities and liabilities. There's a proposal to change that. So to move everyone, regardless of what kind of applicant type you are, onto what we call CUSC Section 15. So that's the kind of wider and attributable securities liability that most people as generators will be familiar with. So there is a proposal, a CUSC mod in process at the moment to try and change that. But for now, you do very much need to be aware that if you're submitting an application as a demand only, you potentially will fall under final sums. And again, that's perhaps something which can sort of be discussed on a side-by-side basis if there's a real reason to not want that to be the case.
And I guess that CUSC mod would just make it better for hydrogen schemes.
It would. There's sort of no downside really effectively to moving on to, it just helps limit the liability that consumers are picking up, whereas final sums can be a very extensive liability that one customer's picking up.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Catherine and Carl. I think that's been really interesting to sort of start to dig into this subject of hydrogen. We're certainly starting to see it from some of the clients we work with, and it's just definitely something that's going to sort of grow and grow. So we're always keen to look into this more and learn about it more. But thank you for listening. Thanks, Carl and Catherine, for taking part, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone here.